what's amazing about debunking the American Revolution is that now in 2020, nobody actually gives a shit about it. You can basically go and be in a bar and be like, man, the British were right. We should still be under King George III. And they'll be like, man, that's cool. It's so cool that you think that. Okay, so I'll try to be brief. Obviously, a very complicated series of events. The American Revolution is basically the Vietnam War in the 18th century, with Britain in the position of the U.S. It's actually a civil conflict in between two factions, kind of not just kind of left and right, but you know, Whig and Tory. But these are also religious factions, so it's dissenter or Puritan against Anglican. You know, all these things are not, they're not consistently aligned, but they're sort of generally aligned. And so, you know, the way from an 18th century English perspective to think of America, imagine you're like a Puritan in England. Suppose, it's not quite the same thing, but suppose you're a libertarian today. And then you hear about the libertarian paradise has been built in Honduras. You would be very supportive of that paradise. And then, you know, if your, you know, government, you know, sent the Marines to go and wipe out the libertarian paradise in Honduras, you would have a bad reaction to that. And so there's this sort of strange situation arises where, you know, there's this conflict between two segments of English society, and then that conflict is a Cold War at home, but abroad it's actually a hot war. And that hot war, essentially the Americans win the war not because they're militarily superior, but because Britain has very little will to fight at any point and loses that will basically completely.
So question, are the Founding Fathers based or cringe?
Well, you know, there's a lot of, you're including a lot of different individuals there.
Well, sort them out then, or the ones,
well,
the ones
you know,
you have views on.
So you know, there's definitely a cringe aspect to Jefferson, but I mean, because, you know, Jefferson, you know, becomes this huge fan of the French Revolution. He's like this massive Francophile. You know, he writes these things about the French Revolution where he's like, you know, the tree of liberty must be watered with blood, you know. Like, have you ever listened to the lyrics of the Marseillaise?
I'm not sure I recall.
Like the French national anthem is all about like, we must drown the country in the blood of the foreigners or whatever the fuck, right? They sing this. So, you know, there are aspects of the American Revolution which are, especially the early American Revolution, which are very, very Jacobin-like. So if you look at a figure like Samuel Adams, who kind of disappears from history because he's just a fuck. You know, like he's like, you know, who would Samuel Adams be? You know, Bill Ayers is not too far away from Samuel Adams, right? He's really just this complete rabble, completely unprincipled rabble-rouser.
And they were all torn on the French Revolution. This was a major point of contention.
Well, later. I mean, of course, this is well before the French Revolution, right? Because it's 1775, right?
Sure.
But you know, and the French Revolution is this kind of dark imitation of the American Revolution done by these Anglophiles, basically. You know, but what of course we forget is that our glorious Constitution, you know, as established in 1789, is established in a reactionary coup. Not only is the Constitution a reactionary coup basically orchestrated by George Washington and his friends, a very monarchical individual, one of the things you'll notice is basically the first, you know, you probably can name, you know, the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. That the period of basically the Congress of the Confederation totally airbrushed out of history. Do you know who America's first president was? It was John Hanson, the president of the Congress. And the results of that system were so disastrous, and the results of that system were identified by people like John Adams literally with democracy. And, you know, basically, like, there was this period of, like, they were just like, this is a shit show. We have to establish basically responsible aristocratic government. We have to replace democracy with oligarchy. And so we're going to run this constitutional convention thing.
But you like that part?
Well, I mean, that part was, you know, that part was an improvement in that situation. This certainly the new republic was very much an aristocratic republic, and it managed to subsist. I mean, people go and watch Hamilton. I mean, God, if they knew the things Hamilton said about democracy. I mean, I'm like, Alex, you got to calm down. I mean, it's a complicated era. You can't reduce the 25 years between 75 and 1800 to like these people were based or cringe. But
sure, of course. I just thought.
If you want to read about this, let's get off this subject, which is very, very technical. And the one thing that I discovered that's absolutely wonderful is, let me tell you, in a form of a parable. Let's say you grew up in Slobovia, imaginary country. And all you go to school, you hear about the glories of the Slobovian Revolution. Of course, that there was a Slobovia before the revolution. There was a period of Slobovia was under the heel of an evil monarchy. That, right? And the hero of the Slobovian Revolution, George Washingtonovich, changed all of that. Statues to him are everywhere. Yada 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 yada. So you grew up believing this, and being like a little cult of personality, this George Slobovich Day, whatever, right? Washingtonovich. And then one day, some people at this company, Slugel, do something weird for like just weird pothead reasons, which is they're like, we're going to put all books ever written in Slobovian online. And of course, this includes books from before the revolution. Like, it includes all kinds of weird books, right? And stuff that's just like totally not cool. And so one day you're on Slugel and you're browsing, these books, and you're like, for some reason you type in the phrase, "True History of the Slobovian Revolution." And the first result, I believe this still works, the first result of this is a book whose title is True History of the Slobovian Revolution. And this book, turns out, was written over 100 years ago. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what these old weirdos 100 years ago thought about the Slobovian Revolution. And you start reading it, and you're like, oh, well, that makes so much sense. Oh, well, I never understood that at all. It's like, so here's an example. Anyone here been to Philly? Probably some people. Ever been to Valley Forge?
Never made it out there.
How close is Valley Forge to Philadelphia? It's like 20 miles. You could walk there in a day, right? So how is it that in the winter of, I think, 77 or 78, I think 77, maybe, 78, whatever, I'm not one for details. Lord Howe is partying like a monster in Philadelphia. He's occupied Philadelphia. He's gone off and left Burgoyne, who was marching down. Remember the Saratoga where the tide turns, yada, yada. You remember like the third grade history. Burgoyne has this plan. Burgoyne, who's an actual Tory, also a playwright, by the way, has this plan to basically cut the Republic in half by invading from Canada down the Hudson. And basically, Howe, who's the overall commander, ghosts him. Literally, like, basically just ignores the plan. Like, he's like, I didn't even get that letter. Goes and occupies Philadelphia, which is a very civilized town, and just, like, parties like an animal all winter. Meanwhile, in Valley Forge, 20 miles away, George Washington is starving with his troops. Now, it was the 18th century. They didn't usually fight in the winter, but come on. Can't you go out there and be like, hey, won't you guys surrender? Do you want a hamburger? And like militarily, it simply doesn't make sense. And, essentially what Sidney Fisher, the author of this book, The True History of the American Revolution, points out is that you just can't understand the history of the American Revolution, just like you can't understand the history of Vietnam if you're only understanding it militarily. You have to have an accurate and what I would call Machiavellian, which just means realistic, understanding of what was actually going on. And once you do, you're like, this makes so much sense. So here you're reading this book, it's not even a primary source, and you're just like, this is much more convincing than anything I've ever learned. So that was like, and the great thing about debunking the American Revolution is that, to quote Henry Ford, all of history is bunk. You can debunk basically any conflict in history. It will be written by the winners. It's always more complicated than that. But, you want to go in and, rewrite the history of World War II, of the Civil War. You can get away with World War I, kind of, you'll get a lot of, that's a very complicated and interesting problem. But the Revolutionary War, what's amazing about debunking the American Revolution is that now in 2020, nobody actually gives a shit about it. You can basically go and be in a bar and be like, man, the British were right. We should still be under King George III. And they'll be like, man, that's cool. It's so cool that you think that.
Well, this is another one of those strange convergences with the radical left-wing critique, right? Because the left also debunks the American Revolution. Oh yeah, we're supposed to admire those people, but really they were property owning, slave owners. That's all bunk. It's in a weird way you're converging with them. And
well, what I would say about if you read you can read Chomsky is a great one for Chomsky is also a pill dispenser. And you'll read it's sort of interesting when you read kind of leftist debunkings, and when I use the word leftist I kind of mean you've kind of become a ring wraith to some extent, and so you're kind of corrupted by when it's someone like Chomsky, say, would read the American Revolution, or any kind of, don't even start me on like the 1619 Project. Basically, they're writing their own history that's generally based on actual facts, although, for the 1619 Project, I think we've gone a little beyond that, but generally based on actual facts, but you're writing this history to be useful. And so you're looking for something, here is a piece of history that is useful to me, right? And in what way could the story of, the Crimean War be useful to the audiences of today? That is the mindset of these people, and that is just not at all the mindset of the historian.
And it comes back to power, doesn't it?
Yes, it comes back to being back to being corrupted by power. And so, the mistake that people who have a problem with this system often make is they imitate it. And they say, well, here's my new history of the American Revolution that's like useful for the opposite reason. And that's not, like, that is also doing a grave disservice to the people, these are real people who fought, in this war. And, if you look at any war in history, you should be able to understand and empathize with both sides and feel and understand why both sides thought that they were fighting for what they thought was right. If you can't do that for any conflict, okay, individuals can be psychopaths, but you can't necessarily identify with a crazy individual. But if you can't identify with a group of individuals, it just means you don't understand them.
Well put.